Picture this. A man wakes up on a Tuesday morning. No alarm, no commute, no boss waiting for a status update. He made it a decision 18 months ago that most people only whisper about at dinner parties. He quit his job to live entirely off his investments. And for the first few months, it felt like he had cracked the code of modern life. Then something strange started happening to his bank balance, something the spreadsheets never warned him about. This is not a story about failure, and it is not a story about success either. It is a story about what happens when a human being steps outside the system that was built to keep him inside it. The system of salaries, health insurance, tax withholding, and predictable paychecks, and instead his entire future on the unpredictable, emotional, and sometimes brutal behavior of global markets. Because here is the truth, nobody puts in the retirement calculators. Money sitting in an index fund is not just a number. It is a living, breathing reflection of human psychology, interest rate decisions made in marble buildings thousands of miles away, and geopolitical tremors that most people never even notice until their portfolio drops 11% in a week. Let's rewind. For most of human history, wealth was tied to land, to labor, to something you could touch. You worked a field, you owned cattle, you built something with your hands, and that was your security. The idea of living purely off the market, off shares of companies you don't run, bonds issued by governments you didn't elect, funds managed by people you'll never meet, is astonishingly new. It's barely a century old in any meaningful, accessible form. And yet today, millions of people are being sold the dream that this fragile, invisible system can replace a lifetime of steady income. The dream has a name now: financial independence. Retire early. A movement born out of spreadsheets and Reddit threads, promising that if you save aggressively enough, invest wisely enough, and hit a specific number, usually 25 times your annual expenses, you can walk away from work forever. On paper, it's beautiful. In practice, it collides with something far messier than math: reality. So let's go back to our man. Let's call him Daniel, because every documentary needs a face, even a fictional one standing in for millions of real stories. Daniel worked in software for 11 years. He lived below his means, invested consistently, avoided lifestyle inflation, and by 39, his portfolio crossed $1.2 million. Using the widely quoted 4% withdrawal rule, a number based on historical U.S. market returns from a study most people misquote without ever reading, he calculated he could safely withdraw around $48,000 a year. Enough, he thought, to live comfortably, enough to be free. He quit on a Friday. He remembers popping champagne that night with his partner. He remembers feeling, for the first time in over a decade, like time itself belonged to him again. What he didn't know, what almost nobody explains clearly, is that the 4% rule was built on decades of market data that assumed a specific historical pattern of growth, inflation, and recovery. It was never guarantee. It was probability. And probabilities have a cruel habit of ignoring individual lives. 6 weeks after he quit, inflation numbers came in hotter than expected. Not catastrophic, not a crisis headline, just a stubborn, grinding kind of inflation that eats quietly at purchasing power while everyone debates whether it's transitory or structural. Grocery prices crept up, insurance premiums crept up, and suddenly the $48,000 that looked so comfortable in a spreadsheet started feeling thinner in real life. This is the first hidden truth of walking away from a paycheck to live off investments. Inflation is not an abstract economic term. It is a silent tax that governments rarely admit to imposing, yet it erodes your freedom every single month you're not earning new income to offset it. When you have a job, a raise can outpace inflation. When you're living off a fixed portfolio, inflation just eats. Quietly, relentlessly, without asking permission. But inflation alone wasn't the real test. The real test came 4 months later, when markets entered a correction. Not a crash. Corrections happen far more often than people think, almost every single year in some form. But this one hit tech-heavy portfolios particularly hard, the exact kind of portfolio Daniel had built during his career in software, loaded with the companies he understood and trusted. In 11 trading days, his portfolio dropped by just over 14%. Now here is where market psychology becomes the real main character of this story. On paper, a temporary drop shouldn't matter if you're invested for the long term. Historically, markets recover. That is, statistically, the most consistent pattern in modern financial history. But statistics don't pay your rent while you're panicking. And this is the part almost nobody talks about honestly. The psychological experience of watching your only source of income shrink in real time is fundamentally different from watching a retirement account shrink while you still have a salary cushioning the blow. When you have a job, a market drop is uncomfortable. When you don't, a market drop feels like the ground disappearing beneath your feet. Behavioral economists have a name for this asymmetry: loss aversion. Humans feel the pain of losing money roughly twice as intensely as they feel the pleasure of gaining the same amount. It's not weakness. It's wiring. It's the same instinct that once protected our ancestors from losing scarce resources in an unpredictable environment. But in modern financial markets, that ancient instinct can quietly sabotage decades of disciplined planning, pushing people to sell at exactly the wrong moment, locking in losses that could have recovered if given time. Daniel, sell. He held on, gritting his teeth through nights of doubt. But he told a friend later that those 11 days felt longer than his entire 11-year career combined. That's the invisible cost of this lifestyle that no calculator captures. The emotional interest rate you pay for financial independence, measured not in dollars, but in sleepless nights and quiet dread. Now, let's zoom out, because Daniel's story is really a small thread inside a much larger tapestry. To understand why living off investments has become both more appealing and more dangerous in recent years, you have to understand the environment that created this movement in the first place. For roughly a decade after the 2008 financial crisis, central banks around the world, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, kept interest rates near zero. It was an emergency measure meant to be temporary. It stretched into over a decade. Cheap money flooded the system. Borrowing became historically inexpensive. And in that environment, stock markets, real estate, and nearly every asset class inflated to levels that felt almost inevitable, almost safe. An entire generation came of financial age believing that markets simply go up. That volatility is a minor inconvenience. That if you just hold long enough, the graph always slopes upward eventually. And to be fair, historically, over long enough time horizons, it largely has. But that near-zero interest rate era wasn't a natural law of economics. It was a policy choice, an emergency response, and like all emergency responses, it eventually had to end. When inflation surged in the early 2020s, driven by a combination of pandemic-era supply chain shocks, unprecedented government stimulus spending, and energy price disruptions tied to geopolitical conflict, Central banks were forced to do something the fire generation had never truly experienced: raise interest rates aggressively and repeatedly. This single shift rewired the entire financial landscape. Suddenly, safe savings accounts and government bonds started offering real, meaningful yields for the first time in over a decade, pulling money away from riskier assets. Suddenly, companies that had grown accustomed to borrowing cheaply had to refinance debt at far higher costs, squeezing profit margins. Suddenly, the mathematical assumptions baked into decades of retirement planning models built largely on the unusually smooth market conditions of the post-2008 decade, started to look dangerously optimistic. This is the part of the story that connects one man's personal financial decision to the entire architecture of global power. Interest rate decisions made in a boardroom in Washington ripple outward with a force most people never fully grasped. They affect currency values, which affect import prices, which affect the cost of everything from imported electronics to gasoline, which affects how far your $48,000 actually stretches in real life. Your early retirement, your freedom, your peace of mind, all of it is quietly tethered to decisions made by people you've never met, debating numbers in a room you'll never enter. And this is where geopolitics enters the frame, because markets don't exist in a vacuum. When tensions rise between major global powers, when energy supply routes are threatened, when trade relationships fracture, capital doesn't just sit still, it moves. It flees to perceived safety. It punishes uncertainty. A conflict on one side of the planet can trigger an oil price spike that raises transportation costs everywhere, which raises the price of literally everything transported, truck or plane, which eventually lands quietly and invisibly in the grocery bill of someone like Daniel, sitting in his apartment, watching his safe withdrawal rate suddenly look a little less safe. This is the deeper lesson hidden inside Daniel's story. Financial independence isn't really independence from the world. It's a bet that you can predict how the world behaves. A bet placed against inflation, against interest rate policy, against geopolitical stability, against market psychology, all simultaneously, for potentially 50 or 60 years of retirement. It is one of the most audacious financial gambles an ordinary person can make, dressed up in the comforting language of spreadsheets and percentages. Now, let's talk about debt, because debt is the invisible twin of this entire story. Governments around the world have been accumulating debt at levels that would have seemed unthinkable a generation ago. And here's the uncomfortable truth about government debt that rarely gets explained clearly. Governments don't repay debt the way individuals do. They manage it. They roll it over. They sometimes, quietly, allow inflation to shrink its real value over time, a strategy economists sometimes call financial repression. It's not theft in any legal sense. It's simply the slow, structural erosion of the value of money itself. And who absorbs that erosion? Not the government directly. It's absorbed by savers, by people holding cash, by people like Daniel, whose future depends on their money maintaining its purchasing power over decades. Every dollar sitting in his portfolio isn't just a number, it's a claim on future goods and services, and that claim is constantly being renegotiated by forces entirely outside his control. This is why history matters so much here, because we've seen versions of this movie before. In the 1970s, a wave of inflation eroded the real value of fixed incomes across the Western world, catching retirees off guard who had planned their finances around a previous decade's more stable conditions. In the aftermath of numerous currency crises throughout history in Latin America, In parts of Asia during the late 90s and elsewhere, people who believed were secure watched the purchasing power of those savings evaporate within months, not because they made poor individual choices, but because the system itself shifted beneath them. None of this means the dream of living off investments is a lie. It means it's far more fragile, far more conditional, and far more psychologically demanding than the polished success stories on social media ever admit. The influencers showing off their laptops on beaches rarely show you the 11 trading days where their portfolio dropped 40%, and they lay awake wondering if made the biggest mistake of their life. So what actually happened to Daniel? This is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because it's neither the fairy tale ending nor the cautionary collapse you might expect. He didn't go back to a traditional job, but he didn't stay purely passive either. After that market correction, after months of psychological strain, he made a decision that financial independence communities often under-discuss. He built a small, flexible income stream on the side, not out of desperation, but out of a hard-earned realization. Total reliance on market performance, with zero active income buffer, created a level of psychological fragility he simply hadn't priced in when he made his original spreadsheet calculations. This detail matters enormously because it reveals something the entire FIRE movement often glosses over in its marketing. The safest version of financial independence isn't usually pure, total withdrawal from all forms of income. It's flexibility. It's optionality. It's the ability to earn a little, even irregularly, precisely during moments markets are punishing you the most, because that small buffer means you're not forced to sell investments at their lowest point just to cover rent. This single insight, the power of flexibility over rigid mathematical purity, is arguably more valuable than any specific percentage or formula, because markets are not just numbers. They are the aggregated emotions of millions of investors, reacting to headlines, fear, greed, and uncertainty in real time. No formula, however elegant, can fully account for human panic. And that brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable insight of this entire story. The financial markets that people are told to trust with their entire future are not simply neutral mathematical systems. They are deeply psychological environments. Every price you see on a stock ticker is the result of thousands of individual humans making emotional decisions, fear during downturns, euphoria during booms, aggregated into a single, deceptively clean number. When you retire early and depend entirely on that number, you are, in a very real sense, depending on the collective emotional stability of strangers you will never meet, reacting to news events you cannot predict. This is not meant to terrify you out of ever investing. Markets, over long stretches of history, have been one of the most powerful wealth-building tools ordinary people have ever had access to. But there's a profound difference between using markets as one tool among several and using markets as the single, sole foundation your entire life stands on. Let's widen the lens one final time, because this story isn't really just about Daniel or early retirees or personal finance influencers. It's about a much bigger, quieter shift happening in how people relate to work, security, and the very idea of a stable future. For most of the 20th century, security meant a job, a pension, a predictable paycheck rising slowly over decades. That system had its own deep flaws, rigid hierarchies, limited mobility, decades tied to a single employer. But it offered something modern financial independence often cannot: a human institution, a company or a government, absorbing some of the risk on your behalf. Today, more and more people are being pushed, sometimes by choice and sometimes by necessity, towards self-directed financial survival. Gig work instead of stable employment. Personal investment portfolios instead of employer pensions. Individual responsibility instead of institutional support. Financial independence, in this light, isn't just a personal lifestyle trend. It's a symptom of a much larger transfer of risk, quietly moving from institutions onto the shoulders of individuals, one decision at a time. And that's what makes this topic so much bigger than any single YouTube headline about quitting job to live off investments. It's a window into how fragile modern financial security actually is beneath its polished surface. It's a reminder that behind every clean statistic, a 4% withdrawal rate, an average historical market return, a comforting compound interest chart, there are real human beings absorbing real volatility, real uncertainty, and real psychological strain. So here's the question worth sitting with long after this video ends. If an entire generation is being encouraged to build on a system sensitive to central bank policy, inflation shocks, and global conflict, how many of them truly understand what they're betting on? And when the next unexpected shock arrives, because history guarantees there will always be a next one, how many will discover, like Daniel did, that the real cost of financial freedom was never just the number in their portfolio, but the quiet, invisible weight of depending entirely on a system that was never actually built to guarantee anyone's safety in the first place?